Hello and welcome to the Event Industry News podcast. This podcast is kindly sponsored by N200 GES, our smart event solution partner. For more information on N200 and its smart event solutions, visit n200.com. So a very good morning, afternoon or evening to all of our viewers who have connected to the live stream of today's podcast via eventindustrynews.com. This is the first time that the podcast has been live streamed, and you'll be pleased to hear that this will now happen regularly at 6 p.m. UK Standard Time. Keep your eye on eventindustrynews.com or download the brand new Event Industry News app, which will keep you notified of all the latest content. The live stream will allow you to interact in real time with our guests, giving you the power to put questions directly to them and get your opinions heard. You can submit your questions via the live stream window on your device or by tweeting us at Event News Blog and including the hashtag EIN podcast. In today's episode, we're going to explore 5 key habits of successful event managers. The topic itself is very subjective, so I'm sure that viewers and listeners will have their own opinions on what we're going to discuss. But to tell us more is today's guest. Joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina, over in the USA, is Alex Lassiter. Alex is the co-founder and vice president of customer experience at Gather, a company that specializes in event management software for restaurants and venues. Alex, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
James, glad to be here.
Fantastic to have you on board. As I said in the introduction, exploring 5 key habits of successful event managers is what I consider to be quite a subjective introduction straight away, because some people's top 5 habits may not be other people's top 5 habits. Other people may say, well, what is a successful event manager, full stop? How do we define it? I've got the 5 habits that we're going to be talking about today. So why don't we open it with that first one? They track event analytics and growth. What can we do with that, and why would tracking event analytics and growth create a successful event manager?
Well, I think your point there at the beginning makes really explains this a lot. Is what does success actually mean? So if I'm an event manager, I think that's the first question I ask everybody is, well, what does it mean to be successful for you? Does that mean that your sales are going to go up? Does that mean that you're going to get more attendees than last year? Does it mean that your guests are going to be delighted? I think the first thing that any event manager really needs to focus on is what's really important to them. And if they look back at the conclusion of the event or the season or the year, they need to determine kind of like what are the results that they're looking to get. I think a lot of event managers, and I think a lot of people in business in general, sometimes struggle to ask that first question before they actually get going. And that sort of leads you to this feeling of, treading water a little bit and not knowing if you're being successful. But I think people need to know where they're headed first before they can actually do anything. And once they do that, it becomes a question of how do you come up with the right analytics to track to make sure that you do hit your goal.
And when we say tracking event analytics and growth, this may sound a strange thing to say, but not all events are necessarily about growth. Mm-hmm. And all events will generate different types of analytics. So is it always necessarily looking at the growing side of things, or is it how the analytics themselves grow? Are there different ways that we can interpret the word growth when we're looking at an event's results?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it all sort of depends on, again, like what kind of your goals on the onset are. If let's take an example where maybe you have maybe you're running an event where the capacity itself can't grow, you can't get more attendees to come. You've got to think about other reasons that you're doing what you're doing, and maybe that could mean from a financial perspective, it could be higher profitability. On another side of things, it could just be delighting your customers. I know that James, I know that y'all plan a number of events every year, and I'm sure that one of the big things that drives you is people coming back and saying, you know what, I've been here, 2, 3, 4 events in a row. I really enjoy it. I find a lot of value in it. I think that's really important. It's not all about sales numbers and more. Sometimes it's about better and higher quality.
Do you think there's any scenario in 2017 where a successful event could happen without tracking analytics of any description?
Well, I think it could happen. I think that you probably wouldn't know if it was successful or not. I think if you aren't measuring anything and you're not really identifying what goals you want to hit, I think it makes it a little bit difficult to be able to kind of look back and assess and feel like you accomplish what you set out to do. I think for some folks, the big question a lot of times is, what are the right metrics to track if you want to increase sales, or you want to increase customer satisfaction, or whatever it might be. I think a lot of times people, if anything, I think sometimes add too many analytics to things, and they track too many numbers, and they don't actually know what the numbers actually mean in the first place.
So what would some of the key analytics in your own particular field of expertise? And at the top of the episode, I introduced you as being from a company that specializes in software for restaurants and venues specifically. So in those scenarios, what are some of the key analytics that your clients will be looking to track in order to help them with their growth and with their further development?
Yeah, absolutely. So I tend to look at sort of two things. One is from a behavioral standpoint, what are the things that we can track? Are we getting more parties? Are more people attending our events? Are more people spending more money at our restaurant? Are our ticket sizes getting larger? And then I think there's another side of it, which is more on the attitudinal side, which is our guests happy? Would they come back? Would they be a promoter of our services? So when I sit down with a restaurant or event venue, the first thing I take a look at is, are we doing the same volume we did last year, or are we doing more? So how many events are we doing in this period versus last year this period? The second thing I look at is, are we getting the same amount of attendance per event, or is that going up or down? So we want to know, are we selling larger parties, or are party sizes shrinking? The last piece in terms of the three big analytics I look at is, what am I getting on a per head spend? So is my average guest coming in and they're spending $100 a head, or are they spending $50 a head? That can make a big difference. Mm-hmm. And neither one of those, by the way, themselves are necessarily good or bad. It's more about, what are your goals? So if I sit down with a client and I look back at the last 12 months and I see that, maybe they've attracted more parties, but they're smaller parties and the price per head has dropped. It's good that they're selling more parties, but at what cost? If their idea of success is to make more money, then they need to figure out ways to increase, the spend per guest, or they need to start looking to reach out to folks who are planning larger parties to be able to attract more people.
And I guess if we were to translate that into other event scenarios, the spend per head example that we would use in the restaurant scenario could translate to the amount of trade stands or booths that an attendee would interact with during a trade exhibition, for example. So it's just fundamentally the same analytic, isn't it? But it's how much you're getting from that particular customer or attendee at an event.
That's exactly right. It's how deep is your relationship with that customer for this business. Like, how much are you actually getting from them for everything that in terms of the goods that you're providing? Are they buying more? Are they interacting more? Are they doing more while they're there?
So that's tracking event analytics and growth. And don't forget, for everybody tuning into the live stream today, that you can submit your questions. If you're on Twitter, go to @EventNewsBlog and tweet us with the hashtag EINPodcast. If you've got a question to put to Alex today, or if you've got a comment on what you think are successful habits of successful managers, and you can also submit the questions via the window that you're using to watch the live stream today. Moving on to point 2, Alex, what we're looking at here as a successful or a habit of a successful event manager. They have a strong digital presence. Now, this would seem, I guess, fairly obvious, again, given that we're 2017 and, even sat right now, we're doing this podcast from opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean using, a digital presence. So is that not something that's pretty obvious, or can we expand on what people know already?
Well, I think people do a really great job today about their social digital presence. I think there's something to be gained from having a more professional digital presence as well. Yes, I think that we're all, at this point, probably all on Facebook and a number of other things, but really making sure that your own personal brand is well represented on tools like LinkedIn and more professional networks, I think is really valuable.
Hmm.
Something that I tell people all the time is think about the different ways that you might interact with a potential client. You can call them on the phone, you can meet them in person, you can send them an email. But there's other things too. So you can get on Twitter and you can find something that they're involved in. You can retweet them. You can connect with them on LinkedIn to establish another relationship connection there. I think as you start to do that, you grow your network,
Hmm.
and you really deepen the relationships that you have with those folks. And it doesn't seem as artificial as just interacting with them on a one-to-one basis.
Sure. We've had some questions start to come in already. One of which particularly I'm actually going to leave till the end before we've covered all five of the good habits, so to speak, and that perhaps gives an indication as to what the question may be. But when we use the term social platforms when we're talking about digital presence, do we still make the mistake in the events industry of thinking that all digital platforms are suitable for all types of events? Now, when I say that, Facebook is a social network and it's an undoubtedly powerful marketing tool. But I still question its relevance in B2B scenarios, for example. How many of your actual business connections are you also connected with on Facebook, and what sort of presence could that have? I would see things as LinkedIn and Twitter as perhaps still being stronger in that scenario. Is there still an evaluation and a careful evaluation that has to take place from event to event to decide which levels of digital presence are actually relevant to an event?
I think there are certainly examples where you may not want to use like a Facebook or something like that. You can be more selective about it. I tend to go from the school of thought of, doing something is better than doing nothing. I think you can
Hmm.
kind of paralyze yourself with decision making if you're trying to decide, is this message more appropriate for Twitter or more appropriate for LinkedIn or more appropriate for Facebook? I think if I'm doing outreach and I'm trying to get the word out about something that I'm doing, I'm going to look at as broad a net as I can cast. That might be on Facebook, it might be on LinkedIn, it might be on Twitter. If I'm trying to establish a real business to business relationship with somebody, I probably start on something that's a little bit less social. So maybe I start with a LinkedIn or a Twitter that's a little bit lighter touch before actually like friending somebody necessarily on Facebook.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that, to me at least, if what you're trying to do is get the word out and you're trying to reach a broader network, you've got to use all the tools that you can. And in the amount of time you probably spend thinking about which one is more appropriate, you probably can defer to action and actually get out and start meeting people.
Um, Question that's come in via the live stream. Did these habits exist before technology? And I guess what the question is looking at, and the angle that it's coming from, is that certainly point one, where we're tracking event analytics and growth, could we have done that, or could a successful event manager have tracked any form of analytics prior to their ability to log into a management system, for example, a registration system, or some other digital tool to help them do that?
Yeah. I mean, definitely analytics. I mean, I think that people have been tracking things for as long as, business has been around. I think that digital tools help to make that easier, and it helps you to consume more information in a more, I guess, in a quicker fashion. Like I can check on the 5 key statistics that my company looks at, on my phone in 5 seconds, which is, 50 years ago, I would probably have to pull up some sort of a ledger or,
Hmm.
something that I've actually written down. But I think for, I think this stuff has been around forever. And I think that, again, if you're not counting and you're not looking at the statistics and the metrics of what you're doing, then, I think you're really behind the 8 ball there.
Okay, let's have a look at point number three then of good habits or habits of a successful event manager. They pay attention to details. What depth of detail are we talking about here? Because some event managers out there may be thinking, well, hold on, how can I pay attention to the minor details when I've got a vast event that I'm looking after? You know, surely my job is to look at it as an overall entity, and then I have team members or other staff or people that are supporting the event who look at the closer details. Do they really need to go into that much detail as an overall event manager?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, to that question, you probably you can't be everywhere at once, right? You can do as much as you can, but I think if you're trying to execute an event, especially on a large scale, the details are what people really remember. You know, if you're really trying to, and in our industry, for instance, we're in the hospitality industry, so for us, the events that we're dealing with are really special events to people. You know, our clients might do 20 or 30 events a month, but if each one of those events is a wedding, you know, or somebody's 50th wedding anniversary or corporate holiday party, those events mean a lot to people. And I think as an event manager, you can sometimes be, I guess to the first point here, you can be looking at the metrics all day and be thinking about dollar signs and number signs. But you have to remember that if you're in the events industry, pretty much everything that you're putting your hands on has additional value to people, and it's important to people, and it's special. And so to that extent, I think that if you're really good at what you do think about the details. You build an extra time to think about small ways to delight your guests. Whether it's, again, in our industry where that is related more to, hospitality and things that you can do to make the guests feel warmer, or even at a large event, doing things that make it feel more personal and feel more topical and more relevant. If you're doing a large event, chances are the person who's attending it is spending a good bit of their day there, or if they're taking off work or they're taking off something that they were going to do before, they're paying a good amount of money to take something back with them. And, I think that the details are really important. You can't look at these things just in terms of dollars and cents.
And I guess everybody can relate to going to an event of some description and feeling a bit like a number, not having that personalized experience. And I suppose it could be difficult to try and contend with that when you are dealing with very large scale events. But I suppose fundamentally, if you've got an event that's attracting in the thousands as its numbers, but you can make everybody walking through that door feel like they're meant to be there and feel like there's something there that's been specifically put together for them, then you are gonna win that battle to an extent of reducing the number of people that feel like they're just another number walking through the door.
Exactly. And I think a lot of that, whether you're planning an event for 10 people or 10,000 people, that first impression is really the most important thing, I think, there. So whether that's registration, whether that's arriving at the restaurant, whether it's kind of setting foot in the venue for the first time, your first interactions, I think, is where the majority of people draw those opinions. And if you can do things to make that more personable, be it have somebody at the front who's got some way to be able to identify somebody on a one-to-one relationship. I see your LinkedIn profile, I know exactly who you are. Or being able to pull other things and kind of bring them in and walk them through what the event's going to look like. And again, in the restaurant industry, walking into a restaurant, having somebody say, hey, Mr. Lassiter, it's great to see you. Here's a glass of your favorite, wine varietal. That's
Sure,
gonna,
yeah.
I'm gonna remember that. Like that is something that I'm gonna go back, and it doesn't matter about a lot of the other things going on. I'm gonna feel warmth, and I'm gonna feel like I belong, and I feel like, again, like you said, I'm not just I'm not a metric. I'm not an analytic on this person's balance sheet.
Now, I guess that the irony about what you've just said there is that point 3 about paying attention to details actually relates back to point number 1, where you're tracking event analytics, because in order to make sure that the attendee or the visitor or the guest or the audience member is not feeling like just another number, you can use the tools that are available now as an event organizer to actually look at the numbers, can't you? If you look at the analytics and you can see what somebody ordered last time, or as I said, looking at the trade exhibition scenario, you can see which company somebody visited last year and what information they picked up from which company, or which particular conference session that they attended last year and what the topic was. You can then use that analytical data to tailor and create that attention to detail the following year, can't you?
Absolutely. And we're at Gather, we are a software company. I mean, that's exactly what we are. We serve the hospitality industry, the events industry, but we tend to think of ourselves more as like a hospitality company that sells software as opposed to the opposite. And as a result of that, by joining Gather, there's a lot of readings that you do. There's a lot of books that we recommend. We're reading one right now called Setting the Table by Danny Meyer. He's a famous restaurateur in the U.S. And basically he has an idea called connecting the dots. So always be connecting the dots. He says ABCD. And I think to your point earlier, in terms of utilizing software or utilizing technology to provide somebody with a better sense of hospitality, it's all about connecting the dots. So you walk in, I'm able to look from your LinkedIn profile that you came, you're from this town and I know a restaurant in that town and you might know that, or you came from this place and you went to school here and I might know somebody else who's done that. But as long as you're trying to use those tools to be able to drive to a higher level of hospitality, I think there's some easy wins to be had.
You sound like a complete pro, because you just mentioned using the right tools, which brings us perfectly on to point 4. Which is utilizing the right tools. One of the habits of a successful event manager is utilizing the right tools. Successful event managers know that they don't have to do it all on their own. Rather, there are several cost-effective technologies to help manage their daily operations. I guess that's absolutely true, and I would agree with that. What I would put to you on that point, utilizing the right tools, is how do they find out what are the right tools when there are so many tools out there nowadays?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's something that, Gather, at least like in our company, we probably use 20 different softwares to be able to do different things. And I think that's just the nature of the world we live in, where there's a technology, there's like an app for anything, and there's a technology for anything. I think you've got to keep your mind open to trying some different things and seeing what's successful. I think none of this stuff, whether it's digital presence or social media or anything like that, none of that stops you from having to go out and network with your community. You should know other event planners around you. You should know other event, managers and venues and restaurants. You should get out in your community, like physically get out and actually go talk to people. I tend to find that the things that I use and like the most are usually referrals. So I'll talk to somebody who's using something that's pretty cool, and I'll play around with it before actually making a decision to purchase it myself. But I tend to think that you've got to stay open and you've got to talk to people.
So when we're talking about utilizing the right tools, what perhaps we may need to get across to people is the right tool may not be something that you access on your computer or your phone or a digital device. It may not even be something physically that you would access in your office space environment. The right tool could be a train ticket to the next city to go and see an event that's similar to yours, to find out what they're doing and see if there's anything that you can pick up on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that so at Gather, for our sales team, we talk about the tools that we have being phone, email, and actually getting out and meeting people. A lot of people wouldn't think of that as a tool, but in the same way that you're describing it there, all a tool is something that helps you get to your goal easier and more efficiently. There's certainly digital tools, there's software tools, but yeah, there's getting out and going to talk to somebody. There's going to another event and doing some mystery shopping and learning what other folks are doing. I think there's a lot of things there. It's just, again, it sort of comes back to, you need to know what your goals are, and you need to know what success looks like, and then you need to find, ideally, the easiest, the fastest, and the simplest way to be able to get there. And a lot of times that's going to be utilizing technology or other things.
Yeah, I'm just going to go flip back a couple of minutes to a quick sentence that you uttered, which is that, there's an app for everything, and there's an app for that. We're all familiar with the term, but I think one of the problems now perhaps is that there isn't just an app for that. There are 10 apps for that,
That's
or
exactly right.
20 apps for that. And that's the minefield, is not finding necessarily something that will do a job that you want to do. It's actually finding which one of those offerings is the right one for you and how they can be used. And that's perhaps the minefield that people have been in. In your experience of dealing, again, specifically in your sector with the restaurant and the venue side of things, you've obviously got your own offering that does a certain job for them, but have you been able to support or help clients when they have been searching for other tools and perhaps make recommendations or help talk them through the process of how they would do that research?
Absolutely, absolutely. When we sit down with a client of ours, when we even internally and externally, we call them partners. We want to be a trusted resource for them, and that's not to say that we're experts on everything, but I think that we are honest, and we're constantly looking around and trying to understand the industry ourselves and listening to people. And what we want to do is be able to provide an honest and trustworthy resource to people. And if one of our clients said, hey, I'm looking for a good point of sale provider, or I'm looking for a good tool to do X, I think that it's hospitable for me to be able to have a recommendation, for me to be there and say, you know what, I'm not an expert on that. That's not something that Gather does, but I do know that a lot of people use this, and I'd be happy to introduce you to some other folks that do. I can still be really helpful without just like solving it. So I think for anybody that's listening on the venue or event planner side, or on the software side, I think leverage the relationships that you have. I wasn't sure where you were going with that question of kind of how do you determine, but I think that if you're looking at business tools, and specifically if we're thinking about softwares and apps and technology tools,
Mm-hmm.
what I challenge everybody to do is to not just look at it as a feature. Don't look at the app or the tool or whatever as a sum of its features. It's more than that. Get to know the people behind it. Have good relationships with your vendors and your partners. And if you're going to adopt a tool that's going to help you in the events industry, get to know the people on the other side, because inevitably, if you're in business for a long time, you want them to be in business for a long time. And you may like what they're doing today, but hell, in 10 years, who knows what we're going to be planning events on, and who knows what the landscape is going to be like, or what sort of softwares or technologies we're going to have. I mean, 10 years ago, it didn't look like, half the things we have today weren't there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. The landscape has changed dramatically. And as you say, with the pace that everything has developed with it, even in the last 2 years, who knows where we could be in 10 years time, and what the right tools may be. And I'm sure that utilizing the right tools and what those tools are is something that is going to evolve inevitably with time as well, and that will either refine itself down. I don't think it's going to continue to grow. Who knows? There may be people out there that completely disagree with that. I think, like a lot of things, when new technologies come to the fore, you have a lot of different offerings, and the cream rises to the top, and sooner or later things refine themselves down to the ones that work well, that are easy to access, and that do the job that they're intended to do quite easily. I don't know if that's something, again, that ties in on that. We should move on to point 5, because today's podcast, if you've just tuned into the live stream, we're looking at habits, 5 key habits of successful event managers, and we're talking to Alex Lassiter from Gather. And point number 5 on the list that we're working through today is they're constantly learning. An event manager, a successful event manager, is constantly learning. And not only that, but they make learning a habit. It's something that they, I guess, ingrain into their very nature, is to constantly be looking to absorb. Rather than asking you what your views are on that particular point, Are you able to reference any clients of your own and customers that you've worked with and partners that you've worked with where you've seen examples of the ones who really do strive to constantly learn?
That's a great question. That is a really great question. Trying to think a really good example because I think a lot of our clients, I think Gather itself is a new technology. We've been around for 3.5, 4.5 years. And if you were to use Gather, then by default, you're kind of looking at new ways to do stuff.
Mhm.
I think somebody that I think does a really great job about really understanding the landscape is actually it's a local restaurant group to Atlanta, where our company's headquarters, called Forward Fries Restaurant Group. When we started with them, I think they had about 5 restaurants. Now they've got over 10. Um, they are constantly evaluating everything. It's
Mhm.
like they live in a permanent state of flux. And it's really cool because there's never this moment where they've got a guy kind of on the operations side. His name's Toby Franklin. He's actually from the UK. And Toby, it's like he's never satisfied with the tools that are out there, but also at the same time is understanding that that's okay. He's always looking at different functions of the business and seeing if there's ways to improve things. Um, I feel like he's got just a mentality that it's not that things aren't or are broken. It's just there's always ways to get better. And so we should always live with like this growth mindset that, yeah, we can always do a little bit better. We can always learn a little bit more. We can always find something that's a little bit stronger. But we need to remain open to that. We need to be, we don't need to be closed off to things, whether it's new softwares or new processes or anything like that. I found it really, really impressive.
Can that be a bit of a dangerous game to play though, for an event manager that might be looking after quite a large team of people? If we've got any staff or event managers from some of the big event companies working there, they'll think, well, hold on, I've got a staff of 50, 60, 70 different people working for me for this particular event. If I'm constantly reevaluating what I'm going to use and what I'm going to do, and I've learned how to do that this week, so now we're going to roll that out. Isn't there a danger then that you can just confuse the message out to your team?
Well, I think it's all about like anything else. It's all about a balance. There's a pretty popular new topic called a growth mindset versus this first a fixed mindset. And the idea is if you're in an organization and it starts at the top, um, and you have a growth mindset, that would mean that you're open to new possibilities. You're opening to better ways of doing things, and you're open to learning. Um, but if you're in an organization with a lot of folks with only a fixed mindset, then you're right. You're gonna confuse everybody. You're gonna face a lot of challenges in terms of moving forward, and things are gonna get disorganized. But if as a leader you can encourage your own folks across the company to also share in that, what you get is honestly a really nimble way to operate, and you've got a way that everyone is constantly looking at ways to make it better. It doesn't mean you have to change directions every 5 minutes, but it does mean that if you can leverage 60, 70 people to be looking at, hey, what is there a better way for me to do this, and you create
Yeah.
avenues for people to be open. I mean, you can do so much. So I guess that I would actually think that it's even more important for a larger company to be able to think like that, because those are the ones that tend to get stuck and then they get disrupted, 10 years later.
I'm going to fire a question at you now, which came in earlier on during the podcast, and it came in via the live stream window that our listeners and our viewers can use to submit their questions whilst we're streaming these podcasts now live. And the question is, what habits should I avoid? Because we've spoken today about 5 habits of successful event managers, so that they're the ones that we're trying to encourage. In your experience of dealing with clients and with event managers, are there any habits that you think that guy could really do with knocking that on the head fairly quickly?
I think the biggest thing is watching your attitude. I think that we're discussing a lot of things today that are challenging, and they require a lot of work, and they require a lot of dedication. Um, the one thing that everybody has control over is their outlook on things.
Hmm.
I tend to find that the folks that are closed off and um, they're met with when they're met with challenges, they sort of react in a stressful way or a negative way. I tend to find that those folks are really getting in the way of themselves being successful. Um, so I think that the big habit that I would say is, don't hold grudges. If you lose out on a deal or things don't go well and you don't find success, don't beat yourself up over it. If you're having a tough day, leave it outside the office and come in with a smile and optimistic point of view. Come in with confidence. Don't I guess that's what I would say is kind of holding things over is a pretty negative thing to do.
Yeah, and I would, I suppose, if I'm going to add, for what it's worth, an opinion or an addition to that, is that life moves so quickly now and at such a pace in any business sector that if you come in, that one day that you come in with a negative attitude could be the one day where somebody's looking for something, they speak to you and they get a bad vibe off you, and so they pick up the phone or they email the next guy and he comes back, boom, straight away, and,
Yep.
and they hit it off, and suddenly the business is gone. Stuff moves so quickly now that there's very little chance, or less chance, I think, than there was 10 or 15 years ago of recovering from a bad day.
Exactly.
If we can call it that.
Exactly. Yeah. Leave it at the door, come in, smile, do your best. As long as you're doing those things, then you're going to find success. Be smart in the way that you approach things and be diligent about it. But yeah, you can't let that stuff kind of get to you. It's business. It's not always going to work out. If it was, we'd all be, millionaires.
I'm keen now that we've sort of addressed each point chronologically and the five habits. Again, I'm quite interested to know whether or not you're able to reference specific examples, perhaps, of some of these points that we've highlighted today, using your experience of your own customers and your own partners. Particularly looking at things like event analytics and growth. You did touch on it very, very briefly, but perhaps looking at some key examples of where a client of yours has looked at something and through a direct correlation to some of the analytics they've been able to look at, they've been able to make a clear business decision that's then had a positive impact.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We've got a client out of Florida. They're a much larger group, and I feel like they're extremely detail oriented. They're very smart about metrics. They're very smart about tracking. But what's really important and what's really interesting about them is that they're not just looking at numbers for the sake of numbers. They look to it for action. They kind of taught us something early on as we were trying to understand the events industry better. And that was really to look at the kind of what we talked about at the beginning, the check average, the amount that your guest is spending per event, as a real opportunity for growth. If you notice that your guests are spending less at events, or maybe you just want your guests to spend more at events, there are ways that you can encourage them to do so while also reaching that goal of a higher level of hospitality. So the good example that we had is if I walked into a restaurant or a venue and the client came right up to me and said, hi, Mr. Lassiter, I know you're really into, I don't know, Oregon Pinots. I've got a great one here for you. That's going to make me feel really good. And then if that person also was able to say, and you know what, we've got a really interesting bottle, on ice right now. If you'd like it, I can bring it out for the table. That makes me feel really good because that person is now responding to something that's very personal for me, and it's making me feel like very warm, but at the same time, they're also encouraging me to, buy another bottle of wine, which is going to drive up, the amount of money that I'm going to spend at the event. So it's just a really cool way. They actually track that, and they look at each one of their individual restaurants and say, these are folks where you have an opportunity to be able to delight your guests more and also to be able to increase that check average. Here's some tools to be able to do that better. But it's very actionable. It's really cool.
I'd like to point out at this point, Alex, that even though this is being live streamed today, and we've got people who are tuning in as we speak, once this is finished today, a copy of the video will go up onto eventindustrynews.com, and the audio will also go up onto iTunes as a podcast. So for anybody who is listening or tuning into this after the live stream, you can still tweet any thoughts and opinions that you've got on what Alex and I have been discussing today to @eventnewsblog and use the hashtag EIN podcast. We'd love to know perhaps what your own good habits are, any advice that you would like to push out into the industry of little things that you may do as an event manager, examples of things that you've done well that relate to some of the topics and the points that we've discussed today. So if you've paid attention to key details, what are those details? What tools are you using? What are the right tools for you, and how have you found out that information as an event manager? We'd love to know what people tuning into the podcast are doing in relation to the 5 habits that we've discussed today, but we'd also love to hear of any other habits that they think make a successful event manager. Next week's podcast, we're going to be looking at what's killing your events ROI. ROI is a subject that crops up regularly on the podcast and has done over the last few years, and people are constantly finding new ways of analysing and trying to identify return of investment and what it means, and how they can improve it. So next week we're going to be talking to Brian Anderson from Captuvate, who's going to be joining the podcast again live next Tuesday at 6 p.m. to look at what's killing your events ROI. We're coming to the end of today's podcast, and I suppose a bit of a flag, a marker, because this is the first podcast that we have streamed live. We've had people watching this as Alex and I have been speaking, and it's also the first one that has been sponsored by N200 GES, our smart event solution partner. For more information on our sponsors N200 and its smart event solutions, please do head over to n200.com and find out a little bit more about those guys. What we're going to do now, though, is wrap up today's episode. Joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina, over in the USA, we've had the pleasure of the company of Alex Lassiter from Gather. Alex, thank you very much for your thoughts, opinions, insight today.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on today.
No problem at all. As I said, if anybody has got anything that they would like to put to the podcast, feel free to use @eventnewsblog on Twitter and use the hashtag EIN podcast. For now, we're going to wrap up today's episode. Thank Alex once again, and we'll see you all next week when we welcome Brian Anderson from Captuvate to talk about what's killing your events ROI. My name is James Dixon. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is the Event Industry News Podcast.